Okie we'll go ahead and get started here. So this is our first live demo in a long time. I think the last live demo we did was, I did rather, was for Thunder Rally, and I think that was a long time ago. So back in June or something, I don't know. Anyways, after a long hiatus, we are back at doing some live demos here, and we're going to take the Next War series as our topic for the next couple weeks. We're trying to do one demo a week here until we can pretty much give a good explanation of the whole system. We'll be using the modules for Taiwan. There is 2 games in the series right now. There's Next War Korea, which I believe is out of stock, out of print. So if you can find one, good on you. The newest one that just came out is Taiwan, and there's one on P500, which is the India-Pakistan game. So go ahead and pledge those pre-orders, please. Thank you. So what we're going to do tonight, though, is I'm going to take you into the system. There are 2 rule books that come with the game. There is a standard series rule book, and knowledge of that rule book will get you into Korea, it'll get you into Taiwan, and it's common rules for the system, and then there are game-specific rules. What can throw people off, though, is that there's actually 2 games in one box. There's what's called the standard game rules, and then there are advanced game rules. And you really need to understand the standard game rules to be able to learn the advanced game rules. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to begin taking you into the standard game. But I want to point out right away that the standard game should not be confused with basic game, because there's nothing basic really about, or simplistic I should say, about the standard game. The standard game is a pretty solid game in and of itself. There's just a few things that are abstracted in the standard game that the advanced game handles in much more detail. The standard game's pretty detailed by itself. What the advanced game will do is it will take the air and it'll take the naval rules and expands them considerably and adds a few more dimensions into the ground game that the basic game leaves out, like special forces, things like that. So we'll eventually get into those things. Game-specific rules will then take the nuances of the particular theater that the game is covering, and it'll bring those nuances into the core system. I think with Korea there are fewer game-specific rules. It just felt like there was fewer game-specific rules with Korea. Korea is a pretty straight-up situation. Both sides are going to be bashing their heads together until eventually the North Koreans break through, and hopefully allies come to the rescue if you're playing that side. So that is kind of the situation you're going to face in Korea. Taiwan is an island. The whole island is pictured on one map, but there's a whole game within a game in the air and naval rules. Even in the standard game, there's a lot happening on the naval end of things that players need to be made aware of. So of the 2 games, I'm going to say that Taiwan is definitely more complex than Korea, just the whole nature of the operation, because you're going to have a combined amphibious and airborne operation just to get a foothold on the island before really the 2 forces can come to blows. Whereas in Korea, you got boots on the ground, and the naval aspect of the game is pretty minimal. It's 2 very large armies just going toe-to-toe. This game requires a little bit more finesse for both players. So, all right, so that's just kind of an overview of the system. What I want to take you into first of all now is the look at the components here, and specifically the counters. If you have your Vassal module open, there's a button on the toolbar that looks like it's got a plus, it's next to the yellow A button. It's a green button with a white plus in it. Go ahead and hit that. If you open or close that window, it's not going to show up on anyone else's screen, so don't worry about messing it up for someone else. Anything you move on the main map will be seen by everybody, but not the charts. So you want to open that up, and you want to look at the, there's a tab in here that will give you the counter info. Yep, counter info tab. Go and click on that, and that'll give you a summary of the types of units that you're going to be dealing with in the game. Now, in the standard game, you're going to have land units and helicopters and naval units. So the units that you see on the left-hand column down at the bottom of that counter info window, that's really what you want to pay attention to. Air units and HQs and supply depots, those are over in the right-hand column. You don't have to worry about those in the standard game. Those are all abstracted out, so you don't have to mess around with that at all. So I want to direct your attention, though, to the land units. There's a lot of information on those that you need to know about. First of all, this game uses NATO symbols pretty heavily. I'm kind of a NATO symbol geek, so I thought I knew my NATO symbols pretty well until I opened this game up. And they got symbols that I had to reference this because I had not seen for a long time. So if you run into a symbol that you're not used to, this is a helpful summary here. The NATO symbols are color-coded. Units of the same formation have the same color interior of the NATO symbol. So if you look at the map, you'll see that all of the Republic of Chinese, we'll call them ROCs for short, all the ROC units that you have around Kaohsiung are, they got like a bright blue interior to the NATO symbol. Notice it is a different color from the Taiwanese Marines in Kaohsiung. It's a lighter shade, almost a grayish blue in the interior of its NATO symbol. So paying attention to those color codes is really important, especially in Korea where you have large and lots of different formations. You really want to pay attention to what formations belong together, because there are disadvantages to going into battle with mixed formations. So that's what's going on with the NATO symbols. Okay, so NATO symbols in the middle there. Most of you guys that you have on the ROC side are infantry right away, so nothing really fancy there. You do have some motorized infantry in Kaohsiung. You have some armor in Kaohsiung. And up in Tainan, you have mechanized infantry. At the bottom of each counter, you have three numbers, the three largest numbers on the unit, the most important. From left to right, they are attack rating. Middle number is defense rating. Number on the right is your movement rating. Now, the movement rating has a color code associated with it. If the movement rating is simply black text in no kind of box or anything, it's just black number, that's leg infantry. If it is a number inside of an orange circle, orange box, like the Kaohsiung Marines, that is, or the motorized infantry in Kaohsiung, that is motorized infantry, motorized movement, I should say. And that's very important for some of the transport rules we'll talk about in a little bit. The armor unit that you see in the northernmost hex of Kaohsiung is got a white number in a red background, and that means it uses armor or mechanized movement. If you look at the terrain effects table, TEC, in the charts in the game, you'll see that there are columns for leg movement, motorized, and mechanized. There is a subset of leg movement that you should be aware of, and that is light infantry. We'll talk about them later, but light infantry has a yellow movement rating in a black box. So that's what's happening with the movement ratings. Another very important number on the units, on the left-hand side of the NATO symbol, there is a white number in a black circle. That's the number of stacking points that that particular unit takes up. We'll talk about stacking units in just a few minutes, but that number is pretty important. That's what's going on with that. On the right-hand side of the NATO symbol, there is a number that is the ER, or efficiency rating number. Higher the number, the higher quality of the unit. Think of it almost like the TQ rating in Great Battles of History series from GMT. In the upper right-hand corner of some units on the ROC side, there's an R in italics, which is indication that that is a reinforcement unit. In the Korea game, the numbers up in the upper right-hand corner is usually a setup hex. If it's a number in italics, then it's a setup hex that is a reinforcement. I think that's about it for the numbers in the upper right. On the upper left is the unit designation, which is not terribly important in in the Taiwan game, unless you're colorblind. If you have a problem with color blindness, then what you want to pay attention to for formations, because you're looking at the color code of the NATO symbol. If you have trouble differentiating the colors, which can happen with Korea because there's so many different formations, if you look at the upper left-hand corner there and you see the unit designation, the number to the right of the hash mark is the name of that formation. So you'll see that all of those Taiwanese units there around Kaohsiung, they have a certain number /8. The exception being the 99th Kaohsiung Marines, which is kind of an independent formation. All right, so that's the units in the game. We'll talk more about the unit types as we encounter them. There are helicopters in the game, in the basic game. I'll show you some of those. There's just one rock unit actually right now down in Hex 2219 at an airbase that I'm not even going to try to pronounce. So, yeah. Now, the thing about the helicopters is helicopters don't actually move. You don't actually move the helicopter unit in the game. The helicopters have to be based either in an airfield, an airbase, a city hex, or an urban hex. We'll talk about basing in just a few minutes, but once they're in a base, then you look at the numbers at the bottom of the helicopter, and you'll see that this AH-64 here in the southern airbase here in Taiwan has two numbers. It has the number 2. That's its combat rating. Let's just call it that. I can't remember the exact term. Combat support is the technical term. So that's the combat support rating. The higher that number, the better it is. The number to the right is its range. So this AH-64 has a range of 16 hexes. So whenever it does a mission, you simply take the counter here, and you can adjust its status by saying that it performs some kind of a mission. I guess here in the vassal module, we could say that it attacked. In the physical game, I'm just trying to see what the thing will actually do here. Oh, it did a support mission. Okay, there you go. That's cool. The thing about it in a physical game is you rotate the counter 90 degrees when it does a mission, and then you rotate it again. Once it's 180 degrees, it's out of mission. So basically, they can do 2 missions under most circumstances, weather permitting. Alright, so what I'm going to go ahead and do here is get him back to his ordinary status, if I can. Mitch, have you any idea how to reset this marker?
yeah, up on the upper right of the vassal toolbar, Joel, you'll see the 2 erasers. Just hit both of them.
Ah, there it is. Okay, that's even easier than I thought. Okay, cool. It's a pretty slick module. I like that. I like that you don't have to rotate the bit around. All right. So that's the deal with helicopters. If you want to make like helicopter sounds, if you can do that, that's awesome. But you don't have to actually move the game counter. Just make those buzzing sounds and machine gun sounds as it does its missions. It looks like here in Vassal, it will also show its radius. That is stinking nice. Yeah, I wish my physical game would do that, right? So if you zoom way out, you can see that this particular AH-64 could cover, looks like 2/3 of the island. So that's pretty cool. All right, so that's helicopters, and we don't have to worry about air units in the standard game, but let's look at some naval units. If I could draw your attention way over to the, let's look at the Republic of China box, upper left-hand corner. And you'll see there's a bunch of units in there. There's some, looks like attack helicopters here. At least one, yeah, one attack helicopter for the PRC. And then there's a carrier battle group, a surface action group, and 4 amphibious task forces. So the thing with naval units is this. Naval units, big number at the bottom is its, what's the technical term here? Its combat support rating. So it can support combats, land combats, if it's in an offshore hex. So the carrier battle group, which is technically not a carrier in the sense that the U.S. carriers are, but it does have some support capability to project power on the shore, and that's what the big number at the bottom is all about. The superscript number is the range at which it can project its combat support. So the carrier unit, that particular battle group only has a radius of a range of 1, so it can only support an immediate inshore hex. Whereas the surface action group has a range of 2, so it's got much more capability of projecting its combat support. Amphibious ships, again, like the carrier, they only have limited combat support capability. So that's what's going on with the ships there. I don't have a US one out, but let me show you something. On the amphibious, you'll see there's another number in the upper left-hand corner, right below the word amph. The number 2. That is the number of stacking points that amphibious unit can haul for transportation. So this guy can take some Marines along with him, so which is kind of the point of an amphibious unit, I guess. If I look at some of the U.S. units, in the upper right-hand corner, there is sometimes an air mobile transport capacity, and what that is we'll talk about later, but it's basically onboard helicopters that can transport ground units from that ship to inshore. So those are the combat units in the game. There is a lot of terrain in the game. I'm not going to go over everything. You can open up the TEC if there's something you don't understand, but it's pretty self-explanatory. The one thing that you really want to pay attention to are there's certain terrain that certain special rules will apply to. And since there's a lot of air mobile, amphibious action and so forth, I want to draw your attention to the things that impact that the most. And the big brown hexes that you see in the middle of the island, that's mountain. It's the most restrictive terrain. Zones of control don't go into mountain. You can't parachute into them. You can air mobile units into a mountain, but only if there's a road running through it. Motorized and mechanized units can't go off into a mountain hex unless there's a road, and they have to go along the road, the hex sides that the roads traverse. So mountain is the most restrictive terrain in there. If you're reading the rules, you'll find the rules make reference to high mountain, and thus far there isn't any high mountain in any of the games that have been published thus far. I am assuming that that's going to be in the India-Pakistan game. If you look near the shoreline, thanks, Mitch. If you look at the shoreline, you'll see that there are some hexes near the shoreline that the hex sides are a darker shade of blue. Specifically, draw your attention to where the mine counters are in the game. You'll see that there are darker borders around those hex sides. What those indicate is they are adjacent to a beach. In the Korea game, beach, I want to say, is defined as terrain that is clear terrain or clear woods. I think that's the rules. I'd have to look it up again.
Yep.
Thanks, Mitch. They made that easier in this game artistically by depicting the all-sea hex sides adjacent to the beach, a darker shade, so you can see clearly where you need to park your amphibious ships to do an amphibious landing. The city of Kaohsiung, Tainan, you'll see that the interior of the hex is darker. That's urban terrain, which has also got some restrictions about it. City terrain is something. City terrain is like a type of terrain within a terrain. So if you look at Fengshan in Hex 1713, you'll see that there's a city in there, but it's still considered clear terrain. So you need to pay attention to things like that. Whereas urban terrain, the whole hex is considered urban. Kaohsiung is considered both city and clear terrain. There are some places in the game that are called installations, and those can be airfields, excuse me, not airfields, but air bases, and ports are installations. And I think the plastics factory in Hex 2807 by game-specific rules is an installation, or at least like an installation. All right, the difference between airfields and air bases. If you look at Hex 1712, you'll see that there's a dark big black circle with looks like an F-15 silhouette inside it. Well, maybe not an F-15, but some kind of, it looks like a jet fighter inside of it. That is considered an air base. The gray circles with, looks like a white P-51 inside of it, those are considered airfields. Airfields are really a scaled down air base. They're easy to capture, difficult to defend, whereas air bases are a bit more tricky to capture for reasons we'll understand later, and obviously easier then to defend. So that's really pretty much all I'm going to say about the terrain. The rest of it, the TEC chart will pretty much cover everything that you need to know about the terrain. All right, stacking. I mentioned earlier that game counters have stacking limitations. Stacking in the game is open to inspection. You can look at each other's stacks if you want. There is an optional rule that allows you only really to look at the top unit in a stack, so you have limited intel. Just kind of a cool optional rule if you like to use that. For ground units, stacking is real simple. You just look at that stacking value to the left of the NATO symbol, and you can generally put 4 stacking points into a hex. The exception being mountain terrain, which is got a stacking limitation of 3. Mountain and high mountain have a stacking limitation of 3 units in a hex, or 3 stacking points in a hex. You got to pay attention because some units, their stacking value will go down when they take a step loss. For example, this motorized rock unit that I moved, I'm going to go ahead and flip him over. And you'll see that he's reduced in strength, but his stacking rating of 2 has remained. That is not always the case, and so you really have to pay attention to that, especially in the Korea game, because there's some units that when you flip them over, their stacking rating actually does diminish by 1, but that is not always the case. So you have to pay attention to that stacking rating. You can voluntarily overstack in the game, but there are some bad things that happen if you overstack. So once again, stacking limitation is 4 units in a hex, 3 in mountains. If you put a beachhead down, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but if you drop a beachhead marker down, the stacking rating of that hex is increased by 2. So look at putting 6 stacking points into that particular hex. That makes the beaches much easier to defend. So what happens if you overstack? Well, first of all, if a hex is fully or overstacked, there's no road movement through that hex, or into that hex for that matter. Normally you can violate stacking, as you move. Let me just go ahead and put some of these pieces down. Let's say that this was the situation that prevailed here up in the mountains. Actually, let's take the armor out. Okay, so if you look at hex 2113, I got an armor unit here. Let's say he's trucking up the road here, and clear the movements off. Okay, he's trucking up this road, but you'll see that hex 2214 is fully stacked. It has 3 stacking points in it. Because that is a mountain hex, this mechanized tank unit will not be able to enter this hex because it is fully stacked. And once a hex is fully stacked, there's no road movement allowed into it. Now, if this were the situation and there was an infantry unit wanted to truck into that hex and move on through, it could potentially enter that particular hex. But it would have to use its off-road movement, which would be forcing it to stop there. So now you would have gone from a fully stacked hex to now an overstacked hex. So what does that do? Well, it does really horrible things. First of all, the ER, or experience rating, of every unit in the overstacked hex is reduced by 1. So that's a really bad place to be. That's a really important value on these units, just like TQ is in Great Battles of History. So all these guys would be rating 4 of troop quality. I'll just say it now. We won't get into it tonight, but I'll say it now that is a column shift in combat. So that is a really big deal. Anytime you're dealing with a column shift, you're dealing with a lot of the equivalent to a lot of strength points. So you don't want your TQ or your experience rating to go down in a hex. So if you're overstacked, the ER rating goes down for every unit, and there is a +1 movement point cost if you want to exit that hex. So let's say it's the beginning of a movement segment and I want to take this tank out of here. Well, normally it only costs half a movement point to move along this road. but because I'm leaving an overstacked hex, and it's, you know, I began my movement rating, my movement there, it would cost 1 extra movement point to get out of there. So it cost me 1.5 movement points to enter a hex that ordinarily would have only cost me half a movement point. So overstacking is bad. Like Mitch said, just, you know, don't do it and everybody will be pleased. Alright, put these guys back. So, helicopters. Ground unit stacking, it's real straightforward. Helicopters, it's even easier. You can put 1 helicopter unit in an airfield. Remember, that's the gray circles with the little P-51 inside. Airfield, city, urban hexes, they can each contain 1 helicopter unit. And if you want to rebase, I told you the helicopters don't move when they do a mission. Well, technically that's not true. If you want to do a rebase mission, you flip the helicopter 180 degrees. In other words, it can't do any more missions for the turn, and you can move it up to twice its movement rating and put it into a suitable hex. You can't go plonking him down out here. You'd have to put him down where there's an airfield, a city, or an urban hex. Now, if you look at Taitung in Hex 2118, theoretically I could put 2 helicopters there because there is both an airfield and a city there. If I were to park him up here at the, Nanking airfield in Hex 2211, I could only put 1 helicopter unit there. Now, if you put him in an air base, like the one I'm not going to pronounce in Hex 2219, if I put him in there, I can actually put 3 helicopters in there. Air bases can accommodate 3 helicopter units, and U.S. amphibious units, task forces, can accommodate 1 U.S. Marine Corps helicopter unit. So we don't have any of those in this particular game setup. So I should also point out that air base that you see in Hex 2219, you'll see that it has a light blue interior jet instead of the normal white. What that indicates is that is a, I think it's called revetted airfield, airbase. It's a fortified airbase. In other words, it's a hardened target. Hardened, that's what it is. Hardened airbase. That really applies in the advanced game, that if you want to attack that with your cruise missiles and with your bombers, it's going to be much harder to inflict damage on that airbase or to attack the helicopter's base there. Alright, so naval units now. What's the deal with stacking with them? I should point out that the Republic of China box, upper left-hand corner, it represents all of China, which history has told us has unlimited stacking. So what's going on here is you don't have to worry about stacking at all for anything. Helicopters, ships, you name it, you can put as much there as they can build. Now, once they leave here, there are some stacking limitations for naval units. If you are in an at-sea box or in an inshore box, you have unlimited stacking. So you'll see that there is a Taiwan Straits inshore box where I have a Taiwanese surface action group. I'm moving it around here so you can see it. It actually doesn't belong in this scenario, but I put it there just to kind of show another game piece. You can put unlimited number of ships there in that inshore box. If you click the naval button on the top toolbar, it'll open up a little window, and that is, in a physical game, a 17 by 11 inch fold-out cardstock depiction of the naval situation around Taiwan. And so I'm not going to cover this in detail right now, but for the most part what you're dealing with there are a bunch of at-sea boxes, if you will, the equivalent to at-sea boxes and inshore boxes. If I take that Taiwanese surface action group, I'm going to move it onto the naval window so you can see me move it around here. Okay, if you look, I just put them in the South China Sea, and that surface action group, that South China Sea is considered to be an at-sea box, if you will. And then there are inshore boxes for this region. Okay, and you can put, there's unlimited stacking in there as well. And these hexagons that are on there, these are actually islands. And there are stacking limitations for those. I'll just let you know there are 3 ground unit stacking points in those little islands. So, but again, we're not going to cover all of the nuances of this naval display. I just wanted you to be familiar with the idea that what look like areas on this map are considered to be the equivalent to an at-sea box or an inshore box. So if you have the Korea game, you don't have this big naval display. You just have 2 inshore boxes and 2 at-sea boxes, and that's it. So it's easier to kind of grasp that concept. Naval units can be put into an all-sea hex. Now that's where stacking is going to kick in, because in an an all-sea hex, like for example, if I take this Taiwanese unit and I put him here in hex 4405, that's the only naval unit that can go in that hex. So per side. So that is a stacking limitation in hexes. Ports are one other exception. There's unlimited stacking in ports. So if you're in a port hex, like if you parked them in here, you can put unlimited stacking naval units in there. But once you head out here, then that's it. That's all that can go in that particular hex. Naval units can only go into all sea hexes or ports. You can't enter, actually, I guess what we'd like to call a coastal hex. You're not allowed to enter those. You have to be in an all-sea hex. So that's the stacking rules. Any questions on anything I've covered thus far? It's all pretty straightforward, I imagine. All right, zones of control. This is a big deal in pretty much any hex encounter game. But there are some little nuances in this game that kind of do some different things when it comes to zones of control. So here's the deal. Every unit projects a zone of control into its own hex. You know, duh. There's a unit there. Now, when I talk about a zone of control, I want you to think the 6 surrounding hexes. So I've got this A marker here that I'm just going to be moving around. So when I talk about a zone of control, I'm talking about the 6 hexes that surround this A marker. Hex 1812, 1911, and so forth. When you enter a zone of control, there's a number of effects that are going to apply. But I need to point out something really, really important. It's easy to miss, and that is that in order to project a zone of control into those 6 surrounding hexes, you have to have more than 1 stacking point. At least 2 stacking points worth of ground units have to be in a hex to project, a zone of control. So all these little guys that you see here, these 1 stacking point guys around Kaohsiung, they don't actually project a zone of control outside of their own hex. Does that make sense to everyone? And that's easy to miss. I can't tell you how many times I've messed that particular rule up because I'm so used to every unit projecting a ZOC. Alright, so remember that you need 2 stacking points to project the zone of control. The effect of zone of control is what you would expect. You have to stop upon entering. So I'm just going to take a Chinese unit here and march him down so you can see what we're talking about. Alright, let's say I got this airborne unit here and I march him here. Let's pretend like we got 2 units in there. So they're projecting a zone of control. As soon as the PRC airborne unit enters hex hex 2011, he has to stop. In addition to that, he also has to pay 1 extra movement point to enter a zone of control if there's no friendly units there already. Let me bring down some of his cousins here from the 43rd Airborne. So let's imagine the 127th and the 43rd is already in a zone of control. Now when the 128th marches in there, he only has to pay 1 movement point. He doesn't have to pay the extra one because there's already a friendly unit in that enemy zone of control. The other effect of zone of control on movement is you can move. If you start your movement in a zone of control, you can move from ZOC to ZOC. So I could take this guy and move him here, but then he would still have to stop. In addition, whenever you move out of a zone of control, if you are the last unit to leave that zone of control, you have to pay an additional movement point. So if the 128th wanted to march down the road to hex 2012 here, he would have to pay 1.5 movement points, half for the road movement, and then 1 extra movement point to leave a zone of control because he didn't have any friendlies left behind in the hex. There are other effects in combat that we'll get to when we get to combat. You can have step losses for retreating through. If you are in a zone of control during certain movement phases like elite reaction, exploitation movement, things like that, then you'll have to you won't be able to move during those periods. Now, I brought these airborne units down here because these are the light infantry I talked about earlier. So I need to cover what these guys do, because when it comes to zones of control, that's where the light infantry do have some really cool effects. So let me go ahead and move this the rock stack here, and I'll take these PRC units and put them there. All right, so here's the deal with light infantry. Zones of control that are projected into flat terrain, which is, see where the A marker is? Those pale hexes, that's flat terrain. Zones of control that are projected into flat terrain or flat woods. Flat woods is like hex 1912 there with the little trees. Zones of control that are projected into flat or flat woods terrain, they affect your light infantry normally. There's no special rules. Light infantry doesn't get an advantage either in flat terrain or in flat woods. But when it comes to zones of control. But here's the thing. Zones of control that are projected into other than flat or flat woods don't apply to your light infantry. So this 127th of the 43rd, it could actually move into here and not have to stop, not have to pay extra movement points, and then it could just continue to move here where it would have to pay an extra movement point because the ZOC would affect it normally here being flat terrain. But hex 2111, it would not apply because that is not flat woods, and you have light infantry moving. So light infantry, they have some, they're very slippery when it comes to restrictive terrain. They also tend to pay less movement points. If you look at the TEC, they tend to pay less movement points in rugged terrain as well. So even though it looks, they only have 4 movement points, they can do a lot with that. So there's some things in combat that light infantry will do as well that we'll talk about in another demo. But for now, you understand when it comes to movement, they have some really neat little functions. Now, what I showed you about being able to slip through zones of control, that only works if you're not using road movement. Okay, if there was a road running through 2111, you could still make that move, but you would not be able to pay the road movement cost and take advantage of that. So in order to slip on through there, not have to stop and keep moving, you would actually have to have you'd have to be using non-road movement. And you can voluntarily do that. Even if there's a road moving through there, you can voluntarily say, I'm not going to be using the road, I'm going to be using the full cost of terrain so I don't have to stop in the zone of control. All right, so that's pretty much it for light infantry for now. Again, they don't have to pay extra to leave a zone of control. As long as they're not in flat or flat woods terrain, zone of control doesn't keep them from moving during exploitation movement or elite reaction, that kind of thing. All right, let's go ahead and start pushing some stuff around here. I'm going to go ahead and put these airborne units back, put the PRC units back where they belong. Let me zoom out here, just easier to do it this way. Take you into the sequence of play here. On the toolbar, if you use that plus button, you'll see a standard sequence of play tab. First thing you encounter in the standard sequence of play, which is pretty much the meat of what you're going to also encounter in the advanced game, you'll see the first thing is a weather phase. Now the scenario I've got set up here is, if you want to make a note of it, it's the first scenario in the game's specific rules called Target Kaohsiung 18.2.1. It's a 4-turn scenario, only uses about 1/3 of the map, and maybe about 1/3 of the units at that. So it's a good place to start. You're going to have an amphibious landing, so you're going to encounter some of the naval end of the game. It's not just ground combat. I've got the whole thing set up here. First thing that happens is weather phase, but per the scenario rules, pretty much every scenario, the Republic of China player gets to pick what they want the weather to be. The idea being that PRC isn't going to invade unless they know what the the weather's going to be at least comfortable for the first turn. Some scenarios let the PRC pick the weather for the first 2 turns, so it depends on the scenario. So in this one, we're just going to go ahead and go with the clear weather, so we don't even have to mess around with that. There is an abbreviated sequence of play function here on the map. There's a track, and in Vassal there's a button you can press to kind of move the sequence of play along. If you look at that track, you'll notice that there are like tan buttons, and then there's kind of a salmon colored buttons, and there are, or boxes rather, and there's light green boxes. Here's the deal with that. The salmon colored boxes are only used in the advanced game, and the green boxes are phases that only occur during initiative, movement, and combat phase. So, next thing we encounter here is the initiative segment of the turn. What happens here during the initiative segment, there's supposed to be a supply phase that is an optional rule. It's not on the phase track, but if you're going to use an optional rule for supply in the standard game, that would be between the weather and initiative. We're not going to worry about that. So in the initiative phase, what first thing you do is you determine if either player has the initiative for the game turn or whether it's going to be a contested game turn. Contested game turns are going to have fewer phases. There's only going to be 1 movement in combat for each side, whereas in an initiative phase, there's a lot more movement and a lot more combat in 1 game turn. Effectively, the initiative player is going to get to move, I want to say 3 times, whereas the defender player is only going to get to move twice, with the exception of some elite units that will get to move 3 times. So, per the scenario rules, the initiative player is the PRC for turn 1. After that, how initiative is determined is based on how many points, how many victory points the other player scored on the previous turn. So there is a game record track that comes with the game. And in Vassal, you click on the button on the toolbar. It has like the letter I. It's over on the left-hand side of the toolbar buttons. If you open that up, you'll see the game information display, and you'll see that there are no VPs tabulated yet, but there is a marker to mark how many VPs you got in this turn. And each game is different. In the Taiwan game, I believe you have to score 11 victory points in order to maintain the initiative for the next turn. So when you get to the initiative phase of the following turn, if your VP's this turn marker is 11 or higher, then you get it. I've been playing the advanced game, so I think that was consistent in the advanced game. But yeah, Mitch says it depends on the scenario. And that number is number of VPs, not number of VPs more than the other guy, right?
Correct.
Yeah, all of a sudden I couldn't remember. All right, so in the initiative phase here, right off the bat, we don't have to worry about that. So just go ahead and move on to the next phase of things. Each player rolls a die on the standard game air point chart and records the air points received this turn. Now, in this scenario, that's already fixed for you. You don't have to roll for it. The PRC gets 12 air points, and the rocks get 4 air points. In the standard game, the air points represent your airstrikes for combat support. In the advanced game, it's much more detailed. But in the standard game, you're just given points that are used to help you in ground combat situations. And personally, I think it actually works pretty darn good. So that's what we would do here ordinarily. But like I said, in this scenario, it's already fixed for us, so we don't have to worry about it. We next need to check the current air superiority. There is a track right below the Republic of China box that has 4 boxes to depict the level of air superiority. And so normally what you do in the standard game is you look at how many air points you have more than the other player. And in this particular scenario, it's actually already set for you what box this thing's going to go into. But in turn 1, the PRC is given air superiority. In turn 2, they'll get air advantaged, and I think the rest of the scenario, it's contested. In the advanced game, it's handled differently. It's based on the number of the number of fighters that survived air superiority combat. You look at who has the most fighters that survived versus the other guy, and you look at the ratio, and the ratio is going to determine where this marker goes and who gets it. All right, once you've done that, during this scenario, I think the AWACS advantage, I think it's only in the advanced game. Nothing happens there. During non-storm turns, you're going to roll for sea control. We're not going to mess with that because the scenario here doesn't call for it, and I'm not going to cover sea control tonight. And then the next thing you would do is mine clearance, but that doesn't happen on game turn 1, so we're not going to worry about that either. Suffice it to say, basically, that sea control and mine clearance, you're going to be basically just rolling on a table for certain sea zones. So we don't need to worry about those tonight. So let's go ahead and move on to the next phase. We're going to skip the ones that are for the advanced phase. We've done the initiative. We've done the air naval. Let's move on to now initiative, movement, and combat. This is the first movement segment where the initiative player, the PRC, is allowed to move all their game pieces. So let's look at the different kinds of movement in the game. The only one we're not going to be able to do tonight is ground movement because well, we don't have any boots on the ground, really. And ground movement's real straightforward. You move hex to hex, you look at the TEC, you pay the terrain cost. If you enter an enemy zone of control, or EZOC, you got to pay an extra movement point if you don't already have friendly units there, yada, yada, yada. So, not a whole lot there to cover that we haven't covered already. So, let's go ahead and look at air transport movement because there are lots of different kinds of movement in the game, and this is the meat of what I wanted to cover tonight. Because even if you want to play the advanced game, you really have to have a firm grasp of the different kinds of movement that this game allows. There's ground movement, there's air transport movement, there's airborne movement, there's air mobile movement, there is naval movement, there's sea transport movement, which is not the same as naval movement. So there's lots of different kinds of movement, and then on top of that you have amphibious assaults. So let's go through them step by step. Air transport movement is not something you're going to do on turn 1, but I'm going to cover it right away because it's the simplest form of air type of movement. Air transport movement is movement that goes from airfield or airbase that's not in an enemy zone of control to another friendly airfield or airbase. Basically, you're going to pick up a piece like this airborne unit, for example. You're going to pick him up because the Republic of China is considered to be an infinite airbase. I'll just pick this unit up. There's obviously no enemy zone of control there. And let's say that I controlled this airbase and it was friendly here in hex 2608. I could just pick him up and plunk him down there. That would constitute air transport movement. So the only units that can use air transport movement are leg units. No motorized or mechanized. So how do I know if a unit is motorized or mechanized? Remember the movement rating. If it's in an orange box, that's motorized. If it's in a red box, it's mechanized. If it's in a black box, it's with a yellow number, it's generally going to be, that's going to be a leg unit. So you just pick your leg unit up from a friendly base, plop him down in a friendly base. Before he can finish that movement, there's one last thing that you have to do. It's called air defense fire, ADF. You have to undergo air defense fire before you land. How that's handled in the standard game is real easy. If you just open up the charts and you look at the MISC charts tab. Alright, it's not the MISC charts tab. Let's see. There we go. The ADA/airpoints tab. If you click on that in the charts, you'll see there standard game air defense fire. And what you do first of all is you look at what does the firing side have? Do they have air supremacy, air superiority, advantage, contested? Are any of those true? You would use those columns. In this case, if it was the PRC moving to this base, we would look at the flying side because the PRC has air superiority, so we would look at the flying side has air superiority and only a result of 0 or less than or equal to -1 will cause this mission to abort. So there are some modifiers that can apply. So you look at the DRMs. You can spend a maximum of 2 of your air points to escort the transport mission, and each of those would provide a +1 die roll modifier. Let's just say we're not going to use any of that. There's also a +3 if the mission is entirely in a home or friendly country. That's not going to apply to the PRC, but it would apply to the ROCs if they were moving a guy from one airbase in Taiwan to another airbase in Taiwan. They would get a +3. Let's just say we're not going to use any of those. If the target hex is within 2 hexes of an enemy airfield or installation or naval unit, there's a -2. -1 if the target hex is in or adjacent to a hex containing an enemy armor or mechanized unit. Lastly, if the attacker, if you flew over a unit, that's only for helicopters and air mobile, so we don't have to worry about that. Alright, so in this case, I just basically roll a die, and as long as I don't roll a 0, we're happy. And I rolled a 4, so that would be a successful air transport. And again, you take off from a hex not in the zone of control, and you land in a hex not in the zone of control. Both hexes are friendly to you. You have to control both bases. Once you land, you can use up to half your movement points rounded up after landing. So air transport allows you to fly into the airport and get your rental car, and you can start driving off. So this guy could start, moving around. So that's air transport movement. Okay, so we're not actually going to do that here. That was just an example, because again, you have to control the bases. The number of air transport missions, let me point that out, that's limited per movement segment. And it's also stipulated in the game-specific rules, the GSR, where you're going to get those, how many air transport missions you get. In Taiwan, the ROCs get 3 transport missions, PRC only has 1. So, and again, when you see that air transport mission counter with a 1 on it, you need to think air transport, not airborne. Sorry, I forgot to key the microphone button. Sorry, guys. What I was just saying there is that's pretty much it for air transport movement. You are limited to the number of air transport missions per movement segment, not per turn, but per movement segment. So theoretically, in this turn, the PRC, they got a movement during the initiative movement combat. They're going to actually have 3 movement segments. You have your regular movement segment, you have exploit movement segment, and then you're going to have a reaction movement segment. There's all kind, excuse me, not reaction movement, but you get a second movement segment. Can you guys hear me now? Alright, good. Voice is back. Alright, good. So, per movement segment, air transport limits in Taiwan is 3 for the ROCs and 1 for the PRC. That's not airborne movement, that's air transport movement. Let's talk about airborne movement. That's different. Airborne units are defined by the game-specific rules. In Taiwan, it's the U.S. 82nd Airborne, the 4th BCT Brigade Combat Team, the 4th and the 25th. So those are the only U.S. units that are considered airborne. You have the Japanese Airborne Brigade, and then you have 3 PRC Chinese airborne divisions, which includes the HQ unit if you're using the advanced game rules. The 43rd, 44th, 45th. There are 3 Malaysian parachute battalions that are considered airborne. And though it's not defined in the game-specific rules 3.3, there is an optional Commonwealth airborne battalion that should also be considered airborne as well. So when we talk about airborne unit, it has to be one of these guys. 101st Airborne for the U.S. is not an airborne unit. It's actually an air mobile unit, and it's going to use helicopters. So airborne unit, how this works is you pick the unit up from a friendly airbase or airfield that's not in an enemy zone of control, and you plunk it down in another space on the map. The other space doesn't have to have an airfield, airbase, or anything like that. It's just that you can't drop into urban, you can't drop into mountain or high mountain. Highland or Highland Woods. Highland is like this darker shade of brown here, and Highland Woods is that darker shade of brown with the little trees in there. So no airborne drops into mountain, Highland, Highland Wood, or urban. City containing or a hex containing installation, you can't drop on this airbase. That's an installation. However, you could drop on this airfield. So you just pick your guy up from your airbase, you drop him into a qualifying hex. You have to undergo air defensive fire before you land. You can also land in an enemy zone of control. Your takeoff can't be in a zone of control, but your landing can. So let's go ahead and just take a bunch of these airborne units and let's do an airborne drop just for grins here. Want to kind of think about where, where do we want to land here in this turn as the PRC. So I'm going to look at the map here and look at where I just kind of hid the counters for a moment on my end so I can look at where are the ports, and I think methinks I want to land some guys like in here, this area. Maybe lay down a carpet of some airborne here. So I'm thinking this might be a good fit for us, and then yeah, something like this. Maybe not optimal strategy, but it puts some pressure on the enemy, and it might help secure our beachhead. So let's go ahead and plan to drop these guys here. What will happen is before they can actually land, we have to roll air defensive fire. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to open up the tables again. And we're going to take the 128th of the 43rd, Hex 1812. We'll deal with him first. We have air superiority, so we looked at all the modifiers. We are within 2 hexes of an enemy airbase, however, so there will be a -2 to our die roll. And we're not adjacent to an armor or mechanized, so it's just going to be the -2. Question is, do you want to spend an air point to modify this landing at all? Let's just go ahead and say no. We're not going to do it. We'll risk it. We'll try to save those air points for later. Might not be a smart move. Well, 4 - 2 is a 2, so we're safe on that table. So he's going to survive air defensive fire. Next thing we got to do is, if you look at the MISC tables tab, there's a paradrop table that he has to roll on to determine what else happens to him. So he's not dropping into an enemy zone of control, so there is no die roll modifier, and he is landing in flat terrain, so anything but a 9 and he's fine. He rolls a 0, so he is right as rain, and he's on the ground. Alright, I'll just kind of pull this guy aside for now. We'll do the 129th, which lands in the coastal hex there, 1811. Again, we're not going to use any of our air points, so 2 becomes a 0, and on the table there, that is an abort result. So that means he's got to go back to his starting base, and he doesn't even get to roll for landing. So too bad for him. Okay, Mitch just clarifies actually 1 roll for both units for ADF, so both those guys are hosed. Ah.
Yeah, a stack that starts together and ends in the same spot is 1 roll for the idiot.
Well, that's yet one more reason why I am not a PRC general. Seems like I suck at invasions here. All right, so that's going to be it for our airborne drop. But let's just, for grins, imagine that we had survived that. Then we would roll for the landing, because it might be more interesting if these guys actually make it on the shore. Let's see, an 8 is he's safe from the for the landing. Anything but a 9, I think, was what it was. So okay, let's just imagine both those guys landed safely. That's what airborne movement looks like. And I imagine if you're dropping 2 units in the same hex, you might want to spend that air point rather than have them turn back. Okay, the number of missions, of airborne missions, is limited by the game-specific rules. In Taiwan, the PRC can lift 4 stacking points worth of airborne units per movement segment. So, in using my original die roll result, these guys get aborted back. It's not entirely over for them. They would still get to try again later this turn in another movement segment. So, but like I said, in the interest of time and everything tonight, I'm just going to say they landed. I don't think your opponent would let you do that, but it's my demo. So, they land. The US, Japanese, Commonwealth, those guys can lift all their airborne units each movement segment, provided, of course, that they're beginning in an air base and all the other situations or restrictions apply. The Malayan units, they can airlift 1 battalion per game turn. You're only going to encounter those guys in the advanced game, though. Now, air mobile, we've covered air transport, which is base to base. Both originating and destination spaces are friendly. Airborne movement is from friendly base to an unfriendly space. Now you have air mobile movement, which is, you need to think helicopters. Air mobile movement is allowed by leg units that have yellow movement allowances. Only leg units with yellow movement allowances are allowed to use air mobile transport. So airborne units can use it. The 101st Airborne, when you look at those guys, go ahead and pull some of those boys out here so you can see what they look like. All right, US 101, let's just throw in these guys down there so you can see. That's what an air mobile unit looks like. And you'll notice that this particular guy has 24 movement points. And I pulled him out there so you could see him because we'll talk about his movement capability. Because some leg units, and when we say some leg units, I think it's only the 101st in the games that have been published so far that have 24 movement allowance. And what that means is they have intrinsic air mobile capability. They have their own transport helicopters with them. So you don't have to use any external resources to move them by helicopter. They have their own helicopters. Sometimes, though, like in Korea, for example, I had the 101st in a place where I needed them to move on foot because I was going to send them off into the mountains. And so you can voluntarily use them as though they were foot units, in which case you need to remember that their movement rating is now 4. So if they're hoofing it on foot, their movement rating is 4. They're still considered light infantry. Otherwise, they'll use 24 movement points and they use air mobile movement. So how this works is air mobile movement has to originate in a friendly airbase, and then you can move up to 24 hexes. The terrain cost is 1 per hex, basically. You're flying over things. You can fly over enemy units. However, there are some things that'll hurt you in air defensive fire if you fly over an enemy unit while you're tracing your 24 movement points. But you begin in a friendly airbase or airfield. You move up to 24 hexes. Terrain, enemy units, EZOCs, all of that's ignored until you land. Okay? Once you land in a hex, if you're not landing in an enemy zone of control, you can advance 1 hex. If you land in an enemy zone of control, you have to stop right there. So 24 movement points, it allows you to move quite a distance in Korea. In this game, you'll see that there's a bunch of PRC units that are in the China box. How does that work? Well, if you look at that naval window again, if you click on the little anchor symbol on the toolbar and open the naval window, you'll see that the PRC box is also depicted in the naval window. And there's a little helicopter icon where it says PRC. And if you look at that helicopter icon, there's arrows that point to the island of Penghu and Taiwan. What that means is both of those locations are considered to be within helicopter range. So you can get from the PRC to Taiwan using your helicopters. But the Chinese probably aren't going to use that as much as, say, the Americans with the 101st Airborne. All right, so airborne movement has some restriction, or excuse me, air mobile movement does have some restrictions as to where it can land. You may not land in high mountain. You You can't land in enemy controlled urban, city, or installation hexes. So we don't have any high mountain yet, but you can't land, say, in here in Kaohsiung. If it was enemy controlled, you can't land in an airbase if it's enemy controlled. Mitch has a comment, so go ahead and jump in, Mitch.
Yeah, sure. I'm not sure if you mentioned it, I just missed it, Joel, but when you're tracing air mobile movement, you start at an airbase, but the unit doesn't have to start at an airbase, right? You can like, if this 123rd Airborne or 128th Airborne Brigade is here, you can start at a friendly airbase, trace to the unit, and then continue moving, as long as you don't trace more than 24 hexes. Now, the intrinsic air mobile guys, they don't have that restriction.
Yes. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. Correct. Yeah, that was not clear how I presented that. If basically you start the 20, like you said, a 24 count. Let's say the Chinese own this air base right here, okay, where the A marker is. You trace 4 hexes to where the 128th is, and then you can pick them up from there and then just drop them off. The intrinsic guys, they got their helicopters wherever they happen to be. Their helicopters go with them. It's when it comes to tracing from the airbase or airfield, it really is for the guys that don't have their own helicopters. And then when you plunk them down, you can't, like I said, you can't land them in an enemy-controlled urban or installation or city hex. We don't have high mountain yet, but once we encounter high mountain, you can't drop them there. You can drop them in mountain as long as there's a road. So you could take these 101st Airborne, you could drop them here. And yes, and Todd asked the question, for those of you listening by video, he asked the question, is there a movement point cost for pickup or drop-off? No, there's not. Not at all. So you can drop off in mountain or in highland woods, as long as there is a road. So that's where air mobile will take you where an airborne drop can't. Remember, you can't airdrop into highland or mountain or highland woods, but you can air mobile there if there is a road running through it. So that's the deal with air mobile movement. You have to undergo your air defense fire before you land. If you take off in an enemy zone of control, then you also have to, it's double jeopardy, if I remember right. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mitch, but I believe that you have to roll for the takeoff and then again with the landing. So that's something you want to think about if you're in an enemy zone of control. The number of missions is limited by air mobile points, and this is what seems to throw me every single time. I think I've probably asked this question more than once, but the deal is the number of missions is limited by air mobile points that is tracked on the game record track. And I believe only the PRC has air mobile points here at the beginning of the game. They got 4, and that is per game turn, not per movement segment. Whereas the airborne movement limitation is per segment. The air mobile points, that's for the whole game turn. Terry asks, if you air mobile into mountain or highlands, so you still get the 1 hex move after the drop. That's only for airborne. With airborne, you're dropping into a hex, and if you land and it's no EZOC, you can advance 1 more space. But with air mobile, you drop and then you stop. You're done for the turn. This is where the game really, if you really grab these mechanics and really get a hold of this, the rest of the game starts to really click together. Since there's so many different kinds of movement, and some of them sound a lot alike. Air transport, air mobile, airborne, and it's all different. So one more time, the number of missions is limited by your air mobile points, and those points can be lost on the air defense table. So if you roll badly on air defense, you can actually lose air mobile points in addition to having the mission being aborted. But you can also get air mobile points per the reinforcement schedule. All right, one last thing about air mobile. Some of the amphibious naval units also have an intrinsic air mobile point to transport Marines from the ships 24 movement points from where the ship is inland, and they can drop them off, and that's per segment. That, if I remember right, though, from the Korea game, I think there was only one Marine unit on the ships anyways that could actually use that capability, and it was generally the U.S. guys that could do that. Mitch, could you clarify what you meant? You were typing something in there. You said technically there's no 1 hex move after the drop. Can you clarify what you mean by that?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. I was just responding to Terry's question. So there's no, you don't drop and then move any hex. You can, if you airdrop or air mobile, you can advance into an installation, a city, or an urban hex.
Oh, okay. So say the 101st lands here, they could then advance 1 hex? Is that what you're saying?
As long as that hex was an urban, city, or installation hex.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, and basically it's just meant to simulate that you're landing right outside the environs, right? And then you're advancing in to take over. Then you'd be placed under that clearing marker.
Okay, yeah. And I won't get to it tonight, but when you enter an urban, a city, or an installation like an airfield or a port, or excuse me, airbase or port hex, when you go into one of those that are enemy controlled, you actually don't take control of it right away. You won't get control until, at the very earliest, the end of the turn, when you do what's called a clearing roll. What'll happen is you'll draw one of these clearing markers from a cup. You don't get to look at the back side of it until the end of the turn when it tells you to flip these guys over. And you flip it over, and you have to roll, I believe, that number or higher. And there's certain modifiers that'll drag your die roll down. It's helpful if you have infantry and mechanized units stacked together for clearing operations. If you fail badly enough and you don't have enough stacking points in a hex, for example, and you fail, you can also take step losses from the guys that are trying to clear that urban environment or that installation. But if you do successfully clear, this marker goes back in the cup, and then you would take control of that space. But that's why there's no landing in enemy installations and so forth. Okay, let's try to wrap things up here with some naval movement, because that's how most of the PRC guys are going to get on shore. Naval units like the surface action groups, the CV carrier battle groups, the amphibious task forces, those are naval units in the game. They can be located in any one of 4 different environments. You can have them in an at-sea box, an inshore box, or a coastal location, which is defined as an all-sea hex or a friendly port hex. Or it can be in a holding box, and that's where all the Chinese Navy units are. They're in the PRC holding box up there. So naval units move individually. You never move them by stack. You move them individually. And they can move during any friendly movement segment except for elite reaction. They can move an unlimited distance from hex to hex. The only limitation on distance is that only 1 at-sea box can be entered. So the sequence of how they would move is these guys in the holding box here are considered to be in a port. So they would actually move from here to the inshore box, located way over here. They would move from there to the inshore box, and then from the inshore box they could then move to an all-sea hex where they could start dropping off their payload, if you will. Now, there are things that can interrupt that. I mean, it sounds very smooth and very fluid, but there are things that can actually interrupt that you may have to make a die roll to find out if that move is actually successful. So let's go over that. You could actually move these guys. Naval units have quite a lot of movement capability because we're looking, I believe, at each game turn is like half a week. It's like 3 days. So these ships can go a long distance in that time period. Okay, so once again, the ships move individually. Now, moving in certain locations is going to provoke a contested sea move die roll. And there's a table that you'll roll on for that. It's located in the MISC tables, I believe, down in the lower left-hand corner. Yep. Contested sea movement. Now, these are the conditions that will cause contested sea move die roll. Movement to or from an enemy-controlled at-sea box, sea zone, or inshore box. So, for example, if I were to take this particular surface action group unit and I move him into the Taiwan Straits inshore box, if there is a Taiwanese surface action group already positioned there, that would provoke a contested sea move. Let's imagine that that was the case here, and let's roll for that. So what will happen here is on this table, there is a die roll here that we make. Standard die rolls. +1 for each surface action group, CV or CVN. Well, we are moving a SAG unit, so we get to roll. We get a +1 for him. We have air superiority, but we don't have air supremacy, so no roll for that. If the allied unit's moving, there is an ASW level modifier. And there's also a submarine modifier, but we're the PRC, so we don't have to worry about that. Those modifiers are only for the Allied side. There's no mine marker in the box. We don't have to worry about that. The inshore box, if it's enemy controlled, there's a modifier. That doesn't apply. So the reference to PRC cruise missiles, we're not going to use that here, but in some scenarios you'll be given a certain amount of cruise missile points that you can spend to grease the skids, as it were, and make your naval movement a little bit easier. So in this case, we just have a +1, so we would roll a die. We rolled a 7 with a +1. It's standard results is, or excuse me, we would have a -1. We're trying to roll low here. So 7 will go down to 6, and that is sea movement aborted. So that means my guy has to stop moving, and he would go back where he came from. So that's how sea movement works in the game. So let me go ahead and get rid of this guy here because he really doesn't belong there. We'll just destroy him. And how do we get rid of him? There we go. Eliminate. All right. So obviously, that guy didn't belong there. So if we wanted to, we could just move this guy into the inshore box, and then from there we could take and we could put him into an all-sea hex where he could do some good. And we're going to park him here because his combat. Yeah, I'd either put him there or there so his combat can support a landing. I think right there might be a better place for him. Now, let's go ahead and load up some Marines here. Let's just take this guy. And we'll take some tanks with him. There we go. Alright, I think that's an amphibious. Okay, now this amphibious ship here that I just positioned in the PRC box, he's got a amphibious capacity of 2. And that means I put 2 stacking points with the ground units with him. So I've stacked him with 2 Marine battalions that each have stacking points of 1/2. And then I stacked him with some mechanized Marines. So we load him up and we can take them to the Taiwan Straits inshore box. If it were enemy controlled, that would be a contested move, so we'd have to roll for that. But again, that situation does not apply here. But now we're going to take him into another hex where we will have to roll. We're going to park him in this hex. So if we put him in here, excuse me, this hex here, when we do that, we run into the area of effect of that mines counter. That mines counter has an area of effect of its own hex. If it's in a coastal location, it will affect its own hex and adjacent hexes. So that is an area of effect, and that would be a contested move. The die roll modifier for that, I just rolled a 2, so we're going to be okay. But the die roll modifier, that would be plus the mine's density, which is 1. So it would be a +1 to the roll, and that becomes a 3, but it's still successful. So that's what contested sea movement looks like in the game. It's just a very simple way of handling the complexities of naval warfare and naval movement. Any move between a port and an all-sea hex, if the inshore box is not friendly controlled, is also contested sea movement. Any kind of movement from all-sea hex to all-sea hex, if the inshore box is not friendly controlled, is contested. So as long as the PRC controls the Taiwan Straits inshore box, they can move from hex to hex in and around the island without having to roll on that table, as long as they stay out of the mine's zone of influence, if you will, area of effect. Whereas the PRC, or excuse me, the ROC surface action groups, if they were to come out of their ports or something, if the Taiwan Straits is PRC controlled, the ROCs would have to roll for contested movement every time they try to do something. In the Korea game, I believe the Koreans end up controlling the sea zones right at the beginning, so it kind of slows down the Allied reaction with their amphibious stuff. But once the Allies get control, the North Koreans can never regain it in that game, and so it becomes much more easy. Now, in this game, the control is much more fluid and goes back and forth. All right, Mitch, you want to clarify, did I mess something up here? Someone asked, does it take 2 movement segments to move a PRC naval unit to an all-sea hex?
So, in order to conduct an amphibious assault, you have to start the movement segment in the inshore box. You could move directly to that all-sea hex, you just would not be able to conduct the amphibious assault because you didn't start in the inshore box.
Ah, that's right. Okay. I had forgotten that. But the SAG can move as far as it did, but the amphibious guys, it takes them a little bit longer. Am I understand that correct now?
Yes. I mean, like I said, technically you could move there, you just could not conduct the amphibious assault. So it's obviously a wasted move, but yes. You have to start, in order to conduct the amphibious assault, you have to start in the inshore box. Start the movement segment in the inshore box.
That's right. There's so many little details in this game that it's easy to miss those things. I actually did that right the last time I played, but when I was rereading the naval movement rules, preparing for the demo tonight, I missed that. Okay, so actually what we'd have to do is we'd have to truck these guys out here, but we're not going to get far enough in the game tonight anyways. That's what it would look like for your amphibious assault. So for the first turn, really, you're just taking these guys out of China, you're putting them in the inshore box, and in this case, it might have been beneficial to try to risk taking the SAG from the inshore box and bringing him in here so that he could support the airborne units. They wanted to try to knock off one of these ROC brigades here before the Marines showed up. But that's what contested sea movement will look like. During storm weather, there's no movement, sea movement allowed, and in fact, guys that are at sea in an at-sea box, they can stay there or they can return to a port. In rare cases, you'll have guys that actually don't have a port or a friendly controlled at-sea box that they can go back to, in which case they're destroyed. Just Halsey's Typhoon kind of thing. All right, one last thing tonight, sea transport movement. Well, actually 2 things. We will look at the amphibious rules real quick, but sea transport movement is a little bit different than naval movement, because what that is sea transport movement doesn't actually involve any naval units at all. It's just you take a ground unit from a port and you move it to another port. There's two kinds, well, that's not exactly true, because there's 2 kinds of sea transport movement. There's port to port, and there's what's called sea landing. Port to port, as you imagine, it takes you from one friendly, undamaged port, not in an enemy zone of control, to another friendly, undamaged port, not in an enemy zone of control. It's kind of like air transport. It's the naval equivalent, I guess, of air transport. You're going from friendly to friendly, no zones of control in either location. If both ports are in the same C zone, that after you land, the ground unit can use up to half its movement allowance rounded up. Any ground unit can use this kind of transport. It doesn't have to be leg units or Marines. Any ground unit. It's a good way to get your heavy units like your tanks and stuff into position. That's why, as the PRC, you need to get a port ASAP. I tried some landings closer to Taipei in a tabletop game, and it did not work out very well at all because there's no ports over there. So I was relying solely on the beachhead, and they bottled me up. So. And as Mitch just pointed out, it's the only way to get your armor onto the island is by sea transport movement. Limitations, I'll go over those in just a second. Sea landing. Okay, there's port to port, and then there's sea landing. Sea landing is a little different because in sea landing, Marine units, which are defined by the game-specific rules, and leg units that have a movement allowance of 5 or less can move between friendly ports and or beachheads in the same sea zone, even if they're in an enemy zone of control. If they're not landed in an enemy zone of control, they can use half their movement allowance, just like the port-to-port movement goes. It's another way to shuttle guys around using your naval capacity around the shoreline. Now, the limitations are specified by the game-specific rules. In Taiwan, the PRC has only 1 stacking point worth. The rock limit is 3 stacking points worth. So the rocks have better sea transport, but again, it's from port to port or from port to friendly beachhead. Unless stated otherwise, no more than 2 stacking points may land at a port or beachhead per turn. Now, I will draw your attention to some of the ports around Taiwan that have a number next to them. Or by Kaohsiung, you'll see the white number 4 off of the port in hex 1513. That means that's a real valuable location because you can offload up to 4 stacking points in that particular port. The one over by Taichung in the middle of the island has 3. Let's see here. There's another one.
Keelung up north has 3.
I'm not seeing it, but I know it's there. Yeah, there's one over by Taipei that's got 3 as well. So yeah, hex 3306 on the north has it. All right, so yeah, that's the limitations then on the ports. And I think you said PRC has a limit of 5, right?
Correct.
Okie dokie, so that is it for your naval or sea transport movement. Lastly, amphibious assault, and I kind of got the wagon before the horse, as was pointed out earlier. Amphibious units can transport your Marines from an inshore box to an all-sea hex adjacent to a beach hex. Units may not move further except to advance after combat. So during the first movement segment, that's when you would shuttle your Marines. You get them positioned in the Taiwan Straits. You go into the combat phase. We do all our combat. There would be elite reaction, which allows units that have an experience rating of 6 or 7 to make a limited move. I believe they can move up to their full movement rating. Is that right, or is it only half? I can't remember.
No, they get a full move as long as they're not in a ZOC.
Okay, that's right. If you're not in a ZOC, yeah, you get full movement. The only rock units that can do that is the Kaohsiung Marines there in Hex 1613 would be able to move. Everybody else would be stand put. So that would happen. Then exploit move. We could take those. We take those guys out of the Taiwan Straits and we could land them. The downside to that is that if we wanted to land them into exploitation combat, which is another combat phase for the PRC to attack, there are some some modifiers that would apply that are unpleasant. So that would be something to think about, especially if you're looking at invading Hex 1909. Now, if you're going to drop them off, say, in Hex 1811 or in Hex 1810, you would be okay because they're unoccupied. They would simply advance after combat into the empty space, and you could plunk down your beachhead marker to strengthen that particular location. Next would be a reaction move. The rock units would be able to move their guys, then they would be able to do combat, and then we would move on to the next movement in combat. Then the PRC would have another normal movement phase, another normal combat phase, and then the other side, the PRC, would have a reaction move and reaction combat. You don't do these green segments during that second movement phase, do you?
No, those are only during the initiative movement and combat phase.
Okay, yeah, I figured that was just vassal, you know, it's kind of a nice thing having this button here, but it made me wonder if I was doing that right.
Yeah, I don't think it's smart enough to know that it should be used sometimes and not.
Alrighty, so that is the nuts and bolts here of movement in the game. We didn't get into combat this time, except for some air defense fire and some contested moves. We'll get into that next week. I'll put an announcement out there, but it looks like we're going to do this on either Monday or Tuesday. Yeah, either Monday or Tuesday of next week, either 2nd or 3rd of next week. Looks like when we're going to do this. So I'll stick around for a few minutes if anyone has any questions. Hopefully this was helpful for you. This is not an easy game to learn. There's a lot in the game, even in the standard game. But it's very rewarding once you get the rules down. It's a very flavorful system. It's a lot of fun to play, but there's an investment involved in learning it. So if anyone has any questions, we'll stick around for a few minutes to answer those, but I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording at this time. And thank you guys for coming out tonight.